Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards. This is a video series where we take an in-depth strategic look at various cards from the board game Dominion. Today we're looking at Workshop. This is a 3-cost action card from the base game, and it says gain a card costing up to 4. So that means you pick a card from the supply that costs 4 or less. It goes, just like when you buy it, it goes straight into your discard pile. It is worth noting that because this is just an action, gaining directly, you do still get to buy something on that turn. You still get your buy phase. This is entirely separate to that. And you're not paying the cost of the card either. You do just gain it for free. So before we can talk about Workshop, we first of all need to discuss build order in your deck, like as a general concept. So when you are first looking over a kingdom, what you really need to do is to have some sort of vague idea of what it is that you're aiming for. So you cannot always in practice actually get the deck that you want. A lot of the times it's going to depend on what your opponent is also doing, but you should generally try to have some sort of plan, even if it's just in the short term. So maybe, for example, there is witch on the board and there's no trashing, so you're like, oh, okay, I'd better get that card as soon as possible, right? Or maybe there is something like chapel and you're thinking, okay, I'm going to buy a chapel straight away because it's really important. You know, usually high priority stuff are things like trashing attacks and draw, because you're looking to get your deck under control first. Now, when you're looking at what's available in the kingdom to do that, what do those cards cost, right? You need to add them to your deck somehow. And you got to be able, if you're looking to buy them, you got to be able to actually afford them. So when you look at the build order, let's say, for example, you have a deck where the only draw is Laboratory, and it's really good to draw your whole deck every turn. Well, you're going to want a lot of Laboratories, and that means that you really want to be hitting 5 very consistently as often as possible. Now, in a lot of cases, there's going to be time when you now want to start getting a bunch of cheaper cards. So these can be like villages, for example. You know, there's no point really early on in the game buying villages until you need them. So at some point you're going to transition into wanting cheap cards, possibly. And that's where Workshop comes in. It gets you a lot of those cards very cheaply, but it doesn't get you more expensive ones. So when you are looking to buy those cards, if you get Workshop early, Workshop makes it very hard to actually hit high economy turns. So if you think about your starting deck with 7 coppers and 3 estates, right? The estates are stop cards that don't generate any money, and Workshop is also a stop card that doesn't generate you any money, but it does gain you cards directly. And if you are reliant on things like silvers or coppers to get to 5, then you can find that having a Workshop use up one of those cards in your hand can make it harder to hit 5. And especially if you did something like opened with 2 Workshops or stuff equivalent to Workshop, you may find that it's actually quite hard to even hit 4 money on a turn when you've just got Workshop or Remodel or cards of that ilk in your starting deck alongside the estate and just the coppers. So Dominion gives you a buy every turn. You always start every turn allowed to buy 1 card by the time you reach your buy phase. It's a resource that the game hands you for free, and it's really important that you use that resource wisely. Obviously, if you're not buying a card on a turn, then that resource they've given you is completely wasted. If you get a Workshop, and that helps you gain a cheap card, but then it also stopped you from buying a card that you wanted that turn, then has Workshop really been that good for you? So let me try and demonstrate this with an example here. So let's imagine that we had a 3-4 opening and we bought a Workshop and some other card, right? And then on turn 3, you draw your Workshop along with 2 coppers and 2 estates. Now, you're going to play that Workshop and you're probably going to gain some card that costs 4, like, I don't know, a poacher or something. But then in this particular kingdom, there aren't any good cards you want that cost 2. Well, in that case, what you do is you end your turn, you've gained a poacher, and you don't buy anything. Now, let's imagine that on that opening turns, you bought a silver instead of a workshop. Well, this hand will now be a silver, 2 coppers and 2 estates, and that's 4 money, and you get to buy the poacher instead of gain it, and you've ended up in exactly the same situation as you did had you gone for the workshop. Except, of course, with the silver, there was the possibility that you drew like another copper instead of an estate, and you hit 5 instead, and maybe that's something you would rather have done, right? So if in getting something like a workshop early, you actually don't care about getting lots of cheap cards right then, has workshop done you a lot of good? So Dominion is a fast game. You really need to get a lot of tempo when you can. Every turn counts in Dominion. And if you've watched the Mine video, you will understand that some cards can be very, very slow to ramp you up. And often it's a lot better to do something that helps you as soon as possible rather than something that slowly ramps up over time. So let's say, for example, you have a deck where you want a lot of villages eventually, and there's a workshop, and you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to buy a workshop at the start, and I'm going to start making a move on gaining all these villages. Now, that means that eventually over time, you can start adding like terminal draw to your deck, and those villages will be there to support that, and that's great. But at the early game, when your workshop is gaining you those villages, if you're not pairing up villages with other terminal actions, and they don't really do anything for you, right? The cantrip effect, the +1 card, and +1 action on village, right? It's basically a cantrip that gives you an action, and cantrips just replace themselves in your deck. Had you just not gained anything, your hand would have been the same if you just simply aren't using the extra action from the village. So, if you are in a state where you wouldn't be buying cheap cards right now, then you probably shouldn't be getting Workshop right now either. The Workshop's pretty good once you've got your deck under control. You're drawing like most of it every turn, and you can still make use of that free buy. So if we go back to an example like where you want a lot of laboratories in your deck, if you can get your deck into a state where you can generate 5 money every turn fairly consistently, it's okay to then start adding a workshop at that point. So you can play the workshop, gain a card costing up to 4 that you want, like Poacher or Village or whatever, and you can still use your buy to gain the laboratory, which is what you really want. So that's a lot of talking about workshop in terms of like using it as an opener, but the general rule sort of applies. You've really got to think what sort of cards you need and the order in which you want them and when you want them. And with workshop, like what you're doing is you're buying a card and then you're shuffling it in, and then when you eventually draw the workshop, you play it and you finally get the card that you probably wanted, right? If you wanted something like merchants or poachers in your deck because you wanted to hit more money to get to 5, or like maybe silver as well for that, then you should probably start by getting that card first, and only once your deck is in the state where it looks like you're doing some of the core stuff you want it to do you then use Workshop to start getting the other cards that aren't such a priority, to help get those quicker. Because, adding cards to your deck is obviously very good. I hope I don't need to tell you that. But it really matters if something that's helping you get those cards is hurting you in other ways, or making you less efficient in others. There is a trade-off there, and there's definitely one with Workshop. Right? It's a terminal. It's a stop card. It's not giving you any money. So those are things that make it really hard to make the most out of your buys on a turn, like that combination of 3 things. You need the action space to support Workshop. You need to draw it because it's not going to draw you any more cards. And it takes up a slot in your hand that's not generating you any money to use your buy. So once you are drawing your deck, though, because Workshop gains you a card in the middle of your action phase, sometimes you get the ability to then draw and play that card on the same turn. And that helps a lot with some of the tempo problems that Workshop might have. So if you think, for example, I want an extra merchant in my deck to generate a little bit more money, you could buy the merchant. Or maybe you decide, actually, because I'm drawing my deck and I have a little bit of overdraw, I'm going to get a Workshop now. And then on the next turn, I can play the Workshop, gain the merchant, and then play the merchant on the same turn. And then that turn still ended up having the extra merchant play in it, which it would have if you'd bought it. But, you've added the Workshop to your deck and you can start gaining more merchants on future turns. Or not just merchant, maybe stuff like village. If you need a village to support the Workshop because currently you're using all of your spare plus actions on other cards, then if you get the Workshop, you might be able to gain a village with it, play that village, and then you can still play all of the other action cards you wanted to because the Workshop gained the village that supports having the Workshop in your deck. So once your deck is under control, Workshop doesn't have these tempo problems with it so much anymore. So I go through all of this just because I know that, at least for me, when I started Dominion, you look at a card like Workshop and you think to yourself, this gets me more cards. Getting a lot of cards is good. I want a lot of good cards in my deck as soon as possible. Workshop looks like a card that really, to get the most out of it, you want to play it as often as you can. But that's true of every card, and Workshop isn't any particularly better necessarily in that regard than anything else. And Workshop has a lot of competition. It's a terminal. It's a stop card. It's got competition for other things that you could be doing instead, like Witch. And so Workshop isn't always necessarily going to be super great early on, even though it feels like it is one that might do. Now, of course, Gainer like Workshop isn't the only way to add lots of cards to your deck. We have plus buys as well. So plus buy and Gainers like Workshop are quite different. While plus buy does help you get the cards, you do need to be able to afford it. However, plus buy doesn't have the same sort of restrictions as Workshop does. Workshop can only ever gain you a card costing up to 4, but an extra buy can potentially gain you an extra province as long as you have the money to support it. Now, this can matter. Obviously, you can have decks where you have plus buy and gainers, but there can sometimes be decks where you would much rather play a card that gives you a buy rather than a card like Workshop and just buy the cheap cards that you need instead of gaining them directly. Situations where you might want that can be ones where it's difficult but possible to draw your whole deck. And you may find a card like Market is a lot better for your deck than a stop card like Workshop. Or it could be that you're just very, very limited on the number of terminal actions you can play. Maybe you can only play 1 per turn, right? There's no village anywhere in the kingdom. And in that case, you might find some sort of terminal plus buy is actually doing more for you than getting a Workshop, because even though you need the money to support it, eventually you may be able to move on to buying 2 provinces per turn, whereas if you'd gone for the Workshop, you could probably never get to 2 provinces per turn because you've only got the 1 buy, and Workshop can't get you provinces. So, buys in general are sort of more flexible in that regard. They do require something to give them the money to work, but there are kingdoms where you have something like Workshop, and actually you'd just rather buy a load of cheap cards rather than gain them with Workshop. So that is something just to watch out for. You have to ask yourself, because Workshop, again, I keep saying, but it's a terminal stop card that doesn't generate you any money. Is that really better than just adding buys and money to your deck instead? You can still ramp up pretty quickly sometimes with a lot of buys and a lot of money, depending on if the kingdom supports it. Sometimes you get cantrip money like Merchant or Poacher, and it's easy to support a lot of them, and cards like Market that get you money and buys. And it can be just way better to just get a load of money that way and just buy things directly. Or you have cards like Bandit that are gaining you golds, and then you just have a load of money. And then if you've got all these golds, well, you might as well have the buys instead to spend it, and then it's really easy to just buy a lot of expensive cards rather than cheap cards, possibly. But cards like Workshop are so kingdom dependent, it's hard to give very specific advice on it. A lot of it's going to depend for cards like Workshop on what else is available. Right, a card like Workshop can be completely useless if there's no other cheap cards that you want to gain a lot of. We need to talk about a strategy called rushes. So there are some strategies called rushes that look to gain a bunch of points and then 3-pile as quickly as possible. They don't necessarily gain a lot of points, but they do want to gain enough just to stop them from being overtaken by like 1 or 2 provinces, or 3, or however many. Usually these are enabled by having some way of getting a lot of cards very fast, and of course cards like Workshop can often help with that. But the basic estate duchy province on its own usually isn't good enough to support a rush, so often you want some sort of extra kingdom victory card that's fairly cheap, like Gardens. So if you look at Gardens, it costs 4, so Workshop can just gain it directly. If you think about a deck that tries to throw as many Gardens into it as possible, one of the big problems that you have is how do you actually generate enough money to buy a Gardens? Because even though it's cheap, if your deck is filled with Gardens, you're not really got room for many treasures, right? How are you getting the money? So Workshop sort of solves that problem by just gaining it directly, and you don't have to worry about actually affording it with your buy. Now, Workshop isn't the only card in Dominion that acts like Workshop. There's actually quite a lot of cards that have this gain a card costing up to 4 on it, as you start adding other expansions in, and a lot of those other ones are actually way better at rushes than Workshop is. So Workshop is sort of... it's okay for rushes, but sometimes you get cards like Groom, which is in Menagerie, which is just really, really good at rushes in a way that Workshop isn't. There is a strategy combo called Workshop Gardens you may have heard about. In the first edition base game, Workshop Gardens in 2-player games was a thing that was the best thing to do on the board a bunch of times. So you just gain workshops, and then you'd use the workshops to get gardens, and then you'd do something like empty estates for your 3rd pile. The problem that the first edition base game had is that there were a lot of weak terminal cards that were added in, so often you just had these kingdoms where you couldn't do very much because they were just made out of a load of weak terminal cards, and Workshop Gardens was really good in those games. Generally, Workshop Gardens in 2-player 2nd edition base games, it's not really a thing anymore. You shouldn't really be having just Workshop Gardens as a rush, and like that's the only thing you do. There are still times when you want to get a workshop and gain some gardens with it, but being the sole strategy is just rushing for that. You shouldn't really be seeing that in 2nd edition anymore, at least for 2 players. If you add more players, then even though you get like the victory cards are a bit bigger, it's a lot easier to 3-pile if you have 2 or 3 players all aiming to empty the same piles as quickly as possible. So you can find games where if you have a group that just wants to play Workshop Gardens a lot, there's not really much you can do about it as like the 4th player in the game, right? Like if they're just emptying the piles that fast, right, you just don't have time to do anything else to actually counter it. So you can still see it in multiplayer games, so do just be aware of that. A couple of final points here. Cost reduction works really well with Workshop. So Workshop gain a card costing up to 4. If you reduce the cost of all the cards that are available, then Workshop can start getting better cards. Right, so if you have some cost reduction that drops 5 cost cards to 4, Workshop can then pick them up. Right, that number 4 on the Workshop description does not change with cost reduction. It's a lot like Buy in that regard. Fairly similar. Buy also likes cost reduction, so it's not unique to Workshop, but it's still cost reduction's great in general as well. I do want to say here, Workshop is probably the weakest of all of the Workshop variants that are available. So if you look at, for example, the Intrigue expansion, which is the first one, there's this card called Ironworks. Ironworks gains cards costing up to 4, and then it gets you an extra benefit as well. And if you gain an action card with Ironworks, then it gives you another +1 action straight away. So it becomes a non-terminal workshop. Well, that's a lot better than just a regular old workshop, right? Being non-terminal, it's so much easier to support it earlier. It doesn't get in the way of your other terminal actions, and it's very, very good. The benefit that Workshop has over all of its peers is that it's a little bit cheaper. So you see this a lot in the base game. They are simple variants of fairly staple effects, and they usually tend to be cheaper. So Smithy, for example, is a terminal draw card, and instead of costing 5, it costs 4, and that's a big difference when you jump from 5 to 4. But Workshop goes from costing 4, which all of its peers does, to only costing 3, and you don't really care about that a lot of the time. This difference between 4 and 3 is not a huge benefit, especially for a card like Workshop that you might only ever gain 1 of, except in a rush. Well, so what if it cost a little less? Usually you have the 4 money to spend on it anyway when you're buying a Workshop. So Workshop doesn't really have any great bonuses in that regard. It does what it does. And it's just a slightly worse version of it. Yeah, so that's sort of everything about Workshop. You really got to think in terms of, its benefit can be quite good, but you really got to take care into when you add Workshop itself to your deck. Sometimes games can be so fast and the aim to have good tempo is so high that you just never really get a chance to get around to picking up Workshop, because you need the value from the other cards that you would be gaining with Workshop, but you need them right now, right? You don't have time to wait a shuffle to get the Workshop and play it and then gain the card that you wanted. So that's sort of the main strategy point I would really like you to just take home here, is to just, watch out for when you want to add Workshop. If you don't need the cards you'd gain with Workshop right now, then it's okay to put it off for a little while. But otherwise, it usually should hopefully be fairly straightforward in a kingdom when Workshop can be good, because it depends on what the other cards cost. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to do what we normally do, and we're going to go to the online client, and we are going to generate some base-only boards that have Workshop in them, and we are going to see... Sorry, I was not in full screen there. How useful it is. So there's quite a lot of 4 or less cards here, which seems really good because there is no trashing, and Laboratory is the only draw. So 5-cost cards are really important here. Now you have got Militia, so you want to stop your opponent getting Witch, so you're going to open Militia. I don't think you open Workshop here. So even though Throne Room, Vassal, Poacher... Well, maybe Vassal's bad, actually, because of this. You don't necessarily care about Harbinger, and Poacher's probably going to be bad as well. Actually, even though you've got a bunch of these 4 costs, you really just want Lab and Witch. There's no plus buy. You just want to get up to 8 and buy a single province. And I think eventually you do want some Throne Rooms. Throne Room is like a village if you play it with Harbingers. Oh, so maybe you do get Harbingers, but that's like gaining 2 cards just for a possible village effect, and it can be hard to actually find the Witch. So I think the Workshop can help you get Gardens, though, and in this sort of really hard to draw everything deck, right? You sort of, this deck, you're probably not ever actually going to draw everything. You just get a load of curses. So you may find that it's better to just buy Throne Rooms directly, like you just don't have time to do much else. Workshop's just sort of getting in the way with all the other junk, and it's not helping you hit the province that you want. So you probably just open like Militia, Silver, you look to get a Witch, and then you just buy a load of Labs, and you hope to cycle quickly and play the same Witch as often as you can, and eventually you get a Throne Room, and you're going to throne Labs, and maybe you get to throne a Witch now and then. And I think provinces are going to be way better than Gardens, and I just don't think there is any reason to care about Workshop. If you can throne Labs, then you can buy more Witches when draw runs out, because you've got like a village effect. And I think you're just trying to draw a load of coppers and silvers. So I think Workshop is skippable here. Even though there are so many 4-cost cards, there are none of these that you want in good enough supply to make getting a load of them important. So what about this one? So we've got Chapel and Sentry for super fast trashing. We're going to trash down very quickly. What does Workshop want a lot of? It can get you a lot of vassals and throne rooms. Well, hey, that's pretty good, actually. With such good trashing, you have got Artisan, but it's only going to be getting you like markets. It can get you throne rooms as well. So Artisan actually not super great here, all things considered. What you really want is you want a load of vassals, and you can get it quicker with Workshop. So you're going to open Chapel, you're going to trash down quickly. You can get a Workshop and use it to start getting vassals and throne rooms. You do eventually want a Sentry with the money, and you want to go like Sentry Vassal to try and just keep churning through. And you got throne room to get a village effect, so it's okay if vassal misses. Eventually you want markets. I guess you probably do still get an Artisan, but I think you get Workshop because you could do with a fair number of vassals here, and it seems a lot easier to get them. Because when you hit 5, you would rather be getting sentries than a market. Instead of using that buy, you do want some, but you're going to want to be spending your money and buys on sentry rather than buying lots of vassals. So I think Workshop is good. Do you open Workshop? Do you just like trash with Chapel and then start gaining the vassals straight away? Or do you instead open like Chapel Silver and hope to maybe hit 5 and get a Sentry early on? I think you don't really need the Sentry early on. I think it's fine. Maybe you do then in this case. Open Workshop and you're looking to just get a bunch of vassals and throne rooms, so it's fine to not hit 5 early on. Eventually the vassals will give you enough money that you can start getting markets, and you'll still just be trashing down with like Chapel, and soon you'll be completely out of anything other than action cards, and you can just start going crazy on vassal with throne room, and should be able to play Workshop quite a lot. So I think Workshop's quite strong here. There is another better gainer with Artisan, but it's not. Maybe you can still get the Artisan anyway, but Workshop's still doing stuff for you. And at the end of the game, maybe later on you can gain a remodel and then turn the Workshop into a better card. And you might be able to do other things with the remodel, like turn a vassal into a duchy eventually or stuff. So I like Workshop there. I think Workshop has good opportunity. I think I'm slightly out on whether you open with it or not, though. What have we got here? Well, we have another board where there is no, there's Sentry for trashing, sorry, but we got Witch. I think Witch is still good, that you want it as soon as you can. So is Sentry, so you want to open Militia and Silver, and you want to stop your opponent getting 5 while you get Sentries and Witches. And eventually you'll be getting labs and festivals, and you are buying a load of expensive cards. And poor old Workshop, what's it getting for you? Harbingers, you don't really care about. Moats, I guess you don't really care about moats. You might be able to buy some with Festival. I think this is a bad board for Workshop. I think you don't want any of these in enough supply. Like moats, okay, but I think Festival makes it easy to just grab a few of them if you need them. And you'd much, much rather have Laboratory instead. You don't really want to do Festival Moat as a draw engine. You'd rather have Festival Witch instead if you're playing some Terminal. Witch is a lot better than Moat. So I think Workshop is a card that you just don't get on that board at all. The cards you can gain with it just aren't very good. Workshop competes with all the other terminals. So here we have Chapel and Militia, I think you open with. You trash with Chapel and you really want to get a Witch. You want to try and get to Witch while you're still trashing down with Chapel, and then eventually you're going to add some like silvers to your deck. Our Poacher's fine, maybe, but so you're going to gain them for money. You're going to build back up, and you want to start getting a load of labs. There is no plus buy here, So do we care about village? I think so. I think you can get some villages and use them to play a number of witches, but that still requires you to get a 5-cost card, right? Like when you look at what Workshop can gain, you don't want this. You don't want to gain this with it. You don't want to gain this with it. Harbinger you don't necessarily care about. I don't think it's good enough to use Workshop to gain that. Villages are only going to be useful in playing more witches per turn. Like you can just have Chapel, Militia, like you just buy a village, right? You're going to have a turn where you don't get 5 all the time at some point. And even if you do, you could get a single village and you might be able to do Witch and Militia on a turn, or you buy another one and you can Witch and Militia and Chapel away any extra curses your opponent gives you. I don't think you need to buy Workshop to enable that, because the actions, you just don't need that many, and to support Workshop you got to get another village just for that, and then you're not using it for anything else. So I think Workshop is bad here. I don't think you get it. I think you just want to draw a lot with Lab, play witches, get 2 golds, get money from Militia, just hit 8, buy a province. So even though there's like village, it's okay to just buy them instead. I think Workshop is just not good enough to add it to your deck. And here's the last one. So there is no village here. There's a lot of terminal +4. So we got Witch, Sentry, Lab again, right? With no village, we probably don't care about Council Room. We'd rather play Witch. We want to get up to 5 as soon as we can. So I think we open... Do we go Smithy and Silver? And just accept that Smithy, we can remodel it into a gold later, right? So I think we open Silver and Smithy, and we do that to try and get to like Sentry as soon as we can, and a Witch. And it's fine that we've got the Smithy there. Eventually, we buy a load of labs and we eventually pick up a remodel, and I think we use that to do a little bit more, like turning the Smithy into a gold. We could eventually get a Bandit once the curses run out, and we will be gaining some golds, and then we can remodel them into provinces to help. I don't think we can escalate our deck well enough to support like playing a Council Room every turn instead. Because you want to add like a bunch of labs, and you don't really want to add a single terminal draw card that's just possibly going to draw a load of labs dead when you play it just with the buy. I think you're better off like getting all the curses out, and then when your deck is clean and all the curses are gone, you can add a Bandit for some golds, and then you can add a remodel, and you can just clean up, turn remaining 5 costs you don't want, or terminals that you're not playing, like Witch, or possibly a Smithy, into golds, and then you can remodel those golds, and that's how you're going to get like more than 1 province per turn, I think. So I think Workshop, again, does nothing for you on this board. You do not want lots of copies of these cards, you just buy them instead. So that's Workshop. There were just... The 5 costs on these particular kingdoms are really good, and Workshop just didn't have a place in a lot of them. That's just how it is. It's so king dependent. You know, this could have gone any way, really. Workshop generally is a fairly weak card overall, when you consider just that you are using the terminal spot to gain cards that you got to wait on instead of using them now because you bought the Workshop instead of the cards you wanted. Like, that matters a lot. And that's sort of the main problem with Workshop. You know, it's not like Remodel where you're also trashing an estate to help you later on. It's just getting you the cards by temporarily clogging up your hand and your terminal space to eventually slowly pick them up later, and that's a problem. But obviously, you know, these sorts of, as you go through more expansions, you start to get some also very strong 4 costs. I mean, you know, Smithy Throne Room there is already pretty strong, but Workshop has its time, has its place. You'll know it when you see it, right? I guess that's my assessment of it there for you. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope this was useful for you. And I hope I'll see you for the next video. Thank you and goodbye.